Okay. Now, what if we want to multiply a vector, multiply natin siya to another vector? Now, like I mentioned before, there are two ways to do this, and one of the two ways is what we call the dot product. Now, this is also called a scalar product. Now, it is called scalar product because if you perform this multiplication, itong dot product, so say you have a vector A, tapos i-dot mo siya with another vector B, what you will get is a scalar quantity. So itong product natin dito na P, this is scalar. Wala siyang direction. Okay, now graphically, what does dot product mean? By the way, kaya siya tinawag na dot kasi dot yung symbol na ginamit natin to indicate yung product between these two vectors. Now, graphically, what does this mean? Say you have one vector dito. Sabihin natin ganito yung itsura ng vector A mo. This is vector A. And then, you have vector B. So, the dot product would be equal, number 1, ang i-multiply mo na values is the magnitude ni B. Okay? Multiply mo itong magnitude ni B. And then, you multiply that sa projection ng ating vector A along vector B. So, paano yun? Let's project it. Parang yung components lang natin last time. Project mo si A, papunta kay B. Now, this length here is what you will multiply dito sa magnitude ni B. Okay? So, itong dalawang length na ito, this one, multiply this to this one. Okay? So, yun yung graphical na meaning ng dot product. Multiply mo itong dalawang values dito, dalawang scalar values dyan. Now, interestingly, what happens if we change yung angle nito? What if pinailalim natin? Mas malapit na siya kay B. Now, if we get yung projection niya, you see na naging longer yung isang factor natin sa multiplication. Okay, so lalaki yung ating dot product. So this time, this is what you will multiply. This length here and this scalar here. So medyo malaki na siya. So that happens when the direction of our vector A is closer doon sa direction ni vector B. Now what happens if we increase further yung angle, almost perpendicular na sila. So if you get yung projection, okay? So ganito na siya kaliit. Okay? Ganyan na siya kaliit. So you will multiply the magnitude ng B dito sa scalar na ito. So mas maliit na siya. So as you increase yung angle, liliit ng liliit yung values. Until such time, this is another interesting case, na if we increase further yung angle, okay, ganyan na yung angle niya. So if you get the projection, you're actually on the negative end nung projection niya. So magiging negative itong projection na ito. So if you multiply this value here, tapos you will multiply negative, let's use broken lines to indicate na negative siya. So what you will get is a negative value for the scalar product. So this one multiplied to this one, this is negative. So you'll have a negative value. So yun yung idea ng scalar product. No? You multiply the magnitude of one vector doon sa projection ng other vector to your first vector. So let's go back. How do we do this mathematically? So graphical yun na expression. So let's say this is your vector A. Now let's say we know yung value ng angle, the angle between the two. So we have phi. Phi here is angle between A and B. Okay? And yung angle between them. So what we are multiplying in dot product is yung length ng B. Tapos the projection ng A kay B. So it will be this length here. Now from our scalar components last time, we can find for the value nung length na ito or nung scalar na ito. And that is simply equal to the magnitude ni A. No? That is our hypotenuse, yung magnitude ni A. So that is A cosine phi. Okay, so that will be this length here. Tapos we will multiply that with this length, which is equal dun sa magnitude ni B. So actually, what happens, our dot product, mathematically, we can define it as, let's multiply ito muna, A cosine phi. Tapos we will multiply that with B. Or we can rearrange yung terms, no? And we can have A times B cosine phi. So this is how we define mathematically yung dot product ng dalawang vectors. What we are going to do, kapag meron kang dot product, what you're going to do is get the magnitude ng first mo na term, multiply that to the magnitude ng second mo na term, tapos you multiply cosine of the angle between them. So our phi is the angle between the two vectors. So ganun lang kasimple yung dot product. And what you will get, these are all scalar quantities. No? So scalar ang makukuha mo, wala kang direction. That's why it is called a scalar product. Now to illustrate further, anong implications nito? Let's look at some examples. So what if you have two vectors that are pointing on the same direction? Ano kayang itsura nung kanilang dot product? Let's say ganun. So you have vector D, tapos you have vector C. Now, we said kanina, the dot product mathematically is equal to, first, magnitude ni C, lagay mo, tapos magnitude ni D, multiply natin, tapos you just multiply cosine of the angle between them. What is the angle between them for this case? No, ano itong angle between them? Now, since they are pointing on the same direction, the angle between them is actually 0. So, phi will be 0. So, ang kinalabasan nito, CD cosine 0 degrees. Now, if you plug this in sa calculator, cosine ng 0 is equal to 1. Okay, so this is simply equal to 1. Magiging 1 lang ito siya. Which means you are left with C times D is equal to C. So, ang nangyari, parang nag-multiply ka lang ng magnitude nila. Now, this is true for every case na pareho sila ng direction. Now, if they are parallel, pareho sila ng direction, you simply multiply yung magnitudes nila and that would be equal to the dot product. So, if C is parallel, pareho sila ng direction, to D, then we simply multiply their magnitude. So, C dot D is equal to C times D. Yung magnitudes lang nila, multiply mo. So, ganun lang kadali. Now, what if opposite sila ng direction? So, let's look at this example here. Okay, so you have vector E na upward, tapos you have vector F na pababa siya. So, what happens to their dot product? So, E dot F is simply magnitude ni E times magnitude ni F, tapos the cosine of the angle between them. Now, what is the angle between vector E and F? So, that is simply this angle here, or pwede din dito sa kabila kasi pareho lang sila, no? This could also be your angle. Now, that angle is actually 180 degrees. Okay? So, if we plug that in dun sa ating equation, so you have E times F cosine 180 degrees. Now, if you put that sa calculator, cosine ng 180, that is negative 1. Okay? So, this becomes negative 1, or E dot F is equal to negative E times F. Now, you still multiply yung magnitude ng dalawang vector, pero this time, ang sagot mo na is negative. So, this is another rule. This is true for all vectors na opposite yung kanilang direction. No? So, parallel pa rin pero baliktad. We call that, in physics, anti-parallel. So, if E is anti-parallel, they are still parallel pero opposite yung kanilang direction. So, if E is anti-parallel to F, then, ang kanilang dot product would be still, multiply the magnitudes, but this time it is negative. Okay? So, ganyan yung rule natin for vectors na opposite yung direction. Now, what if you have vectors na perpendicular? Let's say you have this vector here. Let's call that vector G. Tapos you have another vector that is perpendicular to it. Let's call it vector H. Okay, what happens to the dot product? So, let's write yung equation natin. G dot H is equal to G times H cosine phi, which is the angle between them. Now, our phi, for this case, yung angle between those two vectors, Like I said kanina, these are perpendicular. So this is actually 90 degrees. Now, if plug that in sa ating equation, g times h cosine 90 degrees. Now, sa calculator natin, cosine 90 degrees is actually equal to 0. So if you have cosine 90 degrees, this becomes 0. So your answer is 0. Okay? So this is another rule. If you have two vectors na perpendicular, their dot product is actually 0. If G is perpendicular to H, then yung dot product nila, G dot H is equal to 0. Okay? So that is the rule if perpendicular. Now, what happens if you have a vector? Let's say ito yung vector mo, vector I. Let's call that vector I. Tapos you want to get the dot product of vector I to itself, no? I-dot mo siya sa sarili niya. So you have I dot I. What happens to that? So since our vector I is parallel to itself, diba sabi natin kanina, kapag parallel yung dalawang vector, and clearly, the vector I is parallel to itself, we simply multiply their magnitudes. So, magnitude ng I times magnitude ng I. So, that will be I times I. Or, that is equal to I squared. So, ito yung makukuha mo if you get the dot product of a vector by itself. No? I-dot mo siya by itself. So the dot product of a vector and itself is the square of its magnitude. Okay, so that's what you would get. So I dot to itself, I is the square of that vector. Okay, so yun yung rule natin if you get the dot product of a vector by itself. You simply get yung kanyang magnitude squared. So now let's apply yung mga na-learn natin about dot products to some examples. Okay, let's look at this example here. You have vector A, tapos you have vector D, and then finally you have vector F. So number one, let's try to solve for dot product of D and F. Okay, ano yung dot product ng D and F? Again, from our equation, you simply multiply magnitude ni D times magnitude ni F, cosine the angle between them. Okay, so let's plug in yung ating values. Ang magnitude ni D, that would be 10 inch. Okay, so let's put that. Tapos magnitude ni F is 14. Okay, ito, 14 inches. So let's put 14 inch. Tapos multiply that cosine the angle between them. Now, the angle between vector D and vector F is this angle here, that is 60 degrees. So, let's put that sa ating equation. Okay, tapos we simply plug that in sa ating calculator. So, you have 10 times 14 times cosine 60 degrees. So, you should get 70. Therefore, D dot F is equal to 70. Now, the unit, may isa kang inches dito, may isa ka ding inches dito, so that should be inches squared. So, 2 inches yon. Okay, so this will be the dot product of D and F. Now, how about if we get the dot product of F and A? Okay, so you simply get yung magnitude ni F times magnitude ni A, tapos multiply that sa cosine ng angle between them. Okay? So you should have ang magnitude ni F kanina, that is 14. Magnitude ni A is 11 inch. Tapos let's multiply cosine ng angle between them. So what is the angle between A and F? Now, we know na merong 60 degrees dito. So we simply add itong angle na ito, and this angle here is 90 degrees. So the angle between them would be 90 plus 60. So, nung itsura nun, 90 plus 60, that is 150 degrees. So, let's put that here, 150 degrees. Tapos plug in na lang natin sa calculator natin. So you have 14 times 11 times cosine 150 degrees. So we should have negative 133. So F dot A is equal to negative 133. Again, the unit is inches times inches. So meron kang inches squared. So yan yung dot product ng F and A. Okay? How about if we get yung dot product ng A, kunin natin sa D. Now, if we look at yung A and D natin, ang A natin is ganito yung direction. Tapos ang D natin is pababa. So they are perpendicular. Now, meron tayong rule kanina, if two vectors are perpendicular, tapos you get their dot product, ang dot product nila is simply 0. Okay? So, ganun lang kadali. Pwede nyo na i-apply kaagad yun. 0 na siya kaagad. And finally, what if we want to get the dot product of F dot itself? No? I-dot mo siya sa F. Now, na-mention din natin kanina, if you have a vector, tapos kunin mo yung dot product niya sa self niya, that is simply equal to the square of its magnitude. Or in this case, that is 14, yun yung magnitude niya. Tapos let's get yung square. So you have 14 squared, that is 196. So F dot F is equal to 196 inches squared. So this is now your F dot F. Okay, so this will be useful later pagdating natin sa work done or kahit sa discussion lang natin ng kinematic quantities in vector form. So you'll see yung dot product. So that's how you solve for the dot product.